The distant sound of gunshots echoed across the dusty plains of Promise Creek as Mabel Calloway stood frozen at the edge of town, her father's lifeless body at her feet and the deed to their homestead clutched in her trembling hands. She had exactly 1 week before the bank would seize everything, and not a soul in this God-forsaken town would help a woman alone. It was the summer of 1876, and the Arizona Territory was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. At 22, Mabel had spent her entire life working alongside her father on their modest cattle ranch. Thomas Calloway had been a stubborn, hard-working man who'd raised her alone after her mother died of fever when Mabel was just 5. Now pneumonia had taken him too, leaving her with nothing but debts and dreams too heavy to carry alone. Sheriff Parker had been clear. A woman couldn't hold property without a husband, not in Promise Creek. The territorial laws gave her no standing. Without a man's name on the deed, the bank would reclaim the land within days. "Miss Calloway." A deep voice came from behind her. Mabel turned to find Ethan James, the tall, sun-weathered cowboy who'd worked their north pasture for the past year. He stood with his hat in his hands, his expression solemn beneath the shadow of grief. "Mr. James," she acknowledged, hastily wiping the tears from her cheeks. "I was just saying goodbye to Pa." "I heard about the bank," he said, his voice rough like gravel. At 30, Ethan had the look of a man who'd seen too much, his blue eyes guarded beneath the brim of his worn Stetson. "They're giving you a week," she nodded, too exhausted for words. They'd never been close, she and Ethan. He kept to himself, did his work, and collected his wages without complaint. A good hand, her father had always said, but not one for conversation. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Calloway," Ethan said, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "One that might solve both our problems." Mabel raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening. Marry me." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a six-shooter. "You need a husband to keep the ranch. I need somewhere to put down roots. It would be a business arrangement, nothing more." The cemetery was silent except for the distant call of a red-tailed hawk. Mabel studied the man before her tall, lean, with a face that had seen too much sun and too little joy. "Why would you do this?" she asked, suspicion coloring her voice. "Your father gave me a chance when no one else would." "He was a good man. Besides," Ethan cleared his throat, "I've been drifting for 10 years. Time to stop running." "Running from what?" His eyes darkened. "The past, just like everyone else out here." Mabel looked down at the fresh grave, then back at the deed in her hands. What choice did she have? Marriage to a near stranger or lose everything her father had built. "A business arrangement," she repeated. "Nothing more." Ethan nodded once firmly. "Nothing more. You keep your room, I'll take the bunkhouse. We'll run the ranch together as partners. And if I meet someone I want to truly marry," a ghost of a smile touched his lips, "then I'll disappear. No questions asked." They were married the next morning by the town judge, a brief ceremony with no guests and no celebration. Mabel wore her Sunday dress, Ethan a clean shirt with his usual worn denims. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, Ethan didn't kiss her, just nodded respectfully and signed the marriage certificate with a steady hand. The bank manager's face fell when they presented the updated deed. "Well now, Mrs. James," he said, emphasizing her new name with barely concealed disappointment, "seems you've found a solution to your predicament." "The property stays in the family, Mr. Whitmore," Mabel replied coolly. "As it should." That evening they rode back to the ranch in silence. The two-story farmhouse stood weathered but proud against the setting sun, the barn and corrals stretching behind it. It wasn't much compared to some of the larger spreads, but it was home. "I'll move my things to the bunkhouse," Ethan said as they unsaddled their horses. "The agreement was the bunkhouse," Mabel agreed, "but you can take your meals in the house. No sense in cooking twice." So began their unusual arrangement. Days passed into weeks as they settled into a routine. Ethan worked the cattle and fields while Mabel managed the house and garden. They spoke only when necessary, sharing meals in silence before retreating to their separate quarters. The town gossips had a field day. A marriage of convenience was nothing new in these parts, but the complete lack of affection between Mabel and Ethan raised eyebrows. Some wagered the union wouldn't last the summer. One evening in late August, a fierce storm blew in from the mountains. Rain lashed against the windows as Mabel prepared supper, the kitchen warm against the howling wind outside. Ethan came in drenched, having secured the livestock just as the skies opened. "You're soaked through," Mabel observed, handing him a towel. "Been worse," he replied, his customary response to any hardship. Lightning cracked, so close it made the windows rattle. A moment later they heard a tremendous crash. "The old oak," Ethan said, already moving toward the door. "I'll check it." Mabel followed with a lantern. Through the driving rain, they discovered the massive tree had fallen across the path to the bunkhouse, taking down part of the roof with it. "You can't stay there tonight," Mabel shouted over the storm. "The spare room, then." It was the first time Ethan had slept under the same roof since their wedding. Mabel lay awake listening to the floorboards creak as he moved in the room down the hall, a stranger who was legally her husband. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Mabel found Ethan already in the kitchen building up the stove fire. "You didn't have to do that," she said, surprised. He shrugged. "Seemed fair since you're cooking." They ate breakfast together, still in silence, but somehow less strained than before. When Mabel began clearing the dishes, Ethan stood. "I'll wash you dry," he offered awkwardly. She paused, dish in hand. "I can manage." "I know you can," he said, "but 4 hands work faster than 2. And so they stood side by side at the wash basin, their elbows occasionally brushing as they passed dishes between them. It was such a simple thing, washing dishes together, yet in that domestic moment, Mabel noticed things about Ethan she'd never seen before. The careful way he handled her mother's china, the small scar running along his knuckle, the gentle strength in his calloused hands. "How'd you get that scar?" she found herself asking. Ethan looked down, seeming surprised by her interest. "Barbed wire. First ranch job I had up in Montana. 16 and too proud to admit I didn't know what I was doing." Mabel smiled despite herself. "I got this one." She pointed to a thin line on her forearm, "trying to rescue a chicken from a coyote. I was 8 and thought I was invincible." "Did you save the chicken?" "No," she laughed softly. "But I scared the daylights out of that coyote." It was the first real conversation they'd had, and something shifted between them, subtle as a change in the wind. The bunkhouse took nearly a week to repair. Each night, Ethan slept in the spare room, and each morning they fell into the routine of washing dishes together after breakfast. Those quiet moments, hands in soapy water, became the time they talked. Small things at first, stories of childhood mishaps, observations about the weather, plans for the ranch work. "Why'd you hire on with my father?" Mabel asked one morning, 3 weeks after the storm. "Most cowboys don't stay in one place so long." Ethan was quiet for a moment, his hands stilling in the water. "I was riding through, low on funds. Your father offered a fair wage when I stopped to ask for work, said he needed someone who could break horses. That doesn't explain why you stayed a year." He handed her a wet plate, his eyes fixed on some distant memory. "I was tired. Been riding since I was 17, 13 years of different ranches, different towns. Your father, he treated me like a person, not just another drifter." "Where's your family?" Mabel ventured. "Dead." "My parents had a small place in Texas. Raiders came through during the war. I was out hunting." His voice was flat, matter of fact. "I was the only one left." Mabel's hand brushed his as she took the plate. "I'm sorry." He nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy without meeting her eyes. As September turned to October, the bunkhouse sat empty while Ethan remained in the spare room. Neither mentioned it. They fell into a rhythm, working together during the day, sharing meals, washing dishes side by side. The silences between them grew comfortable rather than strained. Mabel found herself watching Ethan when he wasn't looking. The way the corners of his eyes crinkled when he was amused but trying not to show it. How he always hung his hat on the same peg, smoothed his hair once with his palm. The gentleness he showed to animals contrasted with the strength in his arms as he split wood or wrestled calves at branding time. One evening, they sat on the porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. A cool breeze carried the scent of sage and distant rain. "Winter's coming early this year," Ethan observed. "See those clouds?" Mabel nodded. "Pa could always tell, said he felt it in his bones. Smart man. He would have liked knowing you kept the ranch going," she said quietly. Ethan turned to look at her, his expression softening in the fading light. "You're the one keeping it going, Mabel. I'm just the hired help." "No," she shook her head. "You're more than that now." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. For a heartbeat, Mabel thought he might reach for her hand, but instead, Ethan stood abruptly. "Getting late. I should check on the horses." The first snow came in early November, a light dusting that melted by noon. Promise Creek held its annual harvest dance the following weekend, and to Mabel's surprise, Ethan suggested they attend. "People are talking," he explained, his eyes fixed on the harness he was mending. "Might be good to be seen together, as husband and wife." Mabel felt her cheeks warm. "You hate town gatherings." "I do," he admitted, "but I hate gossip more." She wore her best dress, a deep blue calico that had belonged to her mother. Ethan donned a clean shirt and the black vest he'd worn for their wedding. When he offered his arm to help her into the wagon, his hand lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary. The town hall was decorated with autumn leaves and paper lanterns, crowded with ranchers and townspeople seeking connection before the isolation of winter set in. Heads turned when they entered, whispers following in their wake. "Mrs. James," Sarah Williams greeted her, eyes darting curiously between them. "We weren't sure you'd come. You've been so occupied with ranch work." "Wouldn't miss it," Mabel replied pleasantly, aware of Ethan's steady presence beside her. They danced once, awkwardly maintaining a proper distance as they moved through the steps of a Virginia reel. Ethan's hand at her waist was warm through the fabric of her dress, his movements more graceful than she'd expected from a man who spent his days in the saddle. "You dance well," she remarked as the music ended. A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Don't sound so surprised." Later, as they drove home under a canopy of stars, Mabel found herself studying Ethan's profile in the moonlight. The strong line of his jaw, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "Thank you," she said suddenly. "For tonight," he glanced at her, then back at the road. "Wasn't so bad. The dancing or the pretending," his hands tightened on the reins. "I wasn't pretending, Mabel." The wagon wheels creaked in the silence that followed, each lost in their own thoughts as they made their way home through the silver-washed landscape. Winter descended in earnest the following week. Heavy snow isolated the ranch, the world beyond their fence posts becoming a distant memory. They spent evenings by the fire, Mabel mending clothes while Ethan read aloud from one of the few books they owned, tales of adventure that transported them far from their snow-bound existence. It was during those quiet winter evenings that Mabel realized the truth she'd been avoiding for months. Somewhere between washing dishes and weathering storms, between shared work and shared silences, she had fallen in love with her husband. She watched him reading, firelight playing across his features, his deep voice bringing the words to life, and the realization struck her with such force she nearly gasped aloud. This man, who had married her out of duty and honor, had somehow become essential to her happiness. But did he feel the same? Ethan was kind, respectful, even gentle in his way. Yet he maintained his distance, never crossing the invisible boundary between their arrangement and something more intimate. The spare room remained his, the space between them carefully preserved. December brought Christmas, their first as a married couple. Mabel secretly worked on a gift for Ethan, a new leather belt, hand-tooled with a pattern of oak leaves like the tree that had inadvertently brought them under one roof. She worked on it late at night, hiding it away whenever she heard his footsteps on Christmas Eve, A blizzard howled around the house, the wind finding every crack and crevice. They sat close to the fire, the room warm despite the storm outside. "I have something for you," Ethan said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. Mabel unwrapped it carefully to find a delicate wooden carving of a red-tailed hawk in flight. The detail was exquisite, each feather lovingly rendered. "Ethan," she breathed. "It's beautiful. Did you make this?" He nodded, a rare flush coloring his tanned face. "Noticed you watching them sometimes when you think no one's looking. I never knew you could carve like this. Something my father taught me, haven't done it in years." Mabel traced the lines of the hawk's wings with her fingertip, touched beyond words that he had observed her so carefully, created something so personal. "I have something for you too," she said, retrieving the belt from its hiding place. Ethan ran his fingers over the tooled leather, his expression unreadable. "You made this. Pa taught me leather work, said every rancher should know how to mend their own tack." "Thank you," he said softly. Their eyes met across the firelight, something unspoken passing between them. The blizzard continued through the night, the temperature dropping to bitter cold. Mabel woke before dawn, shivering despite the quilts piled on her bed. The fire in the main hearth had died down to embers, and frost patterns decorated the inside of her window. Wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders, she made her way downstairs to rebuild the fire. To her surprise, Ethan was already there, coaxing flames from the coals. "Couldn't sleep," he explained, not looking up. "Too cold." Mabel moved to his side, drawn to the growing warmth. "The spare room gets the worst of it. That north wind cuts right through." "I've slept through worse." They stood side by side, watching the flames grow stronger. Outside, the wind moaned around the eaves, a lonesome sound in the pre-dawn darkness. "We could conserve heat," Mabel said suddenly, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "Share a room just until the storm passes." Ethan went very still, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "Mabel, it's practical," she hurried on. "Nothing more." "Like our arrangement." He studied her face for a long moment. "Is that what you want? Practicality?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning. Mabel gathered her courage, taking a step closer to him. "No," she whispered. "That's not what I want anymore." Ethan's eyes darkened, his expression shifting from guarded to something raw and honest. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he raised his hand to her face, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "What do you want, Mabel?" "You," she said simply. "Not the arrangement. Not the partnership, you." His breath caught audibly. For a moment he seemed frozen, searching her eyes as if looking for doubt or deception. Finding neither, he lowered his mouth to hers, a kiss as gentle as it was profound. When they pulled apart, Mabel saw in his eyes what she'd longed to see for months, not duty or obligation, but genuine affection, desire, perhaps even love. "I've wanted to do that since the first time we washed dishes together," he admitted, his voice rough. Mabel smiled, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. "Why didn't you?" "Our agreement. I gave my word it would be business only." His hand moved to the small of her back, drawing her closer. "And I wasn't sure you wanted anything more." "I wasn't sure either," she confessed. "Not at first, but somewhere along the way." "Everything changed," he finished for her. They spent Christmas Day in a new kind of closeness, the barriers between them finally dissolved. Ethan moved his few possessions from the spare room to hers now, theirs that evening. As winter deepened, so did their connection. The physical intimacy they discovered was matched by an emotional openness that surprised them both. Ethan spoke of his years of drifting, the loneliness that had been his only constant companion. Mabel shared her fears of failing her father's legacy, of never finding her own path. "I used to think marriage was the end of independence," she told Ethan one night as they lay entwined beneath the quilts. "That's why I never pursued it, even when Pa hinted I should. And now." His fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Now I understand it's not about losing yourself, it's about finding someone to walk beside you." She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "I'm glad it was you, Ethan, even if we started for all the wrong reasons." He pulled her down for a kiss. Maybe they weren't so wrong after all. Spring came early that year, the snow retreating to reveal tender green shoots beneath. The ranch flourished under their combined care, Mabel's practical management complementing Ethan's skill with the livestock. Together, they achieved what neither could have done alone. On the anniversary of their wedding, Ethan surprised her by taking her to the creek that gave the town its name. A picnic was laid out beneath a cottonwood, wildflowers scattered across the blanket. "What's all this?" Mabel laughed as he helped her down from her horse. "Thought we deserved a proper celebration. Last year was lacking." They ate beside the burbling water, talking about their plans for expanding the herd, perhaps adding sheep to diversify. When the meal was finished, Ethan took something from his saddlebag. "I had this made in town," he said, handing her a small wooden box. Inside was a silver ring set with a small pearl, simple but elegant. "We did things backward," Ethan explained, suddenly looking uncertain. "Married first, fell in love after, but I thought, maybe we could start fresh, do it right this time." Mabel felt tears spring to her eyes as he took her hand. "Mabel Calloway, James," he said formally, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I married you because it was the right thing to do. I stay because I can't imagine life without you. Will you be my wife? Not out of duty or practicality, but because I love you more than I thought possible?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice catching. 1,000 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the passion and tenderness of a man truly in love. They renewed their vows the following Sunday, this time surrounded by friends and neighbors. The celebration afterward was everything their first wedding had not been: joyful, communal, a true beginning rather than a reluctant compromise. As they danced under lantern light in their own barn, Mabel rested her head against Ethan's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Happy?" he asked, his lips close to her ear. "More than I knew was possible," she answered truthfully. Years later, when their children asked how they fell in love, Ethan would always smile and say, "It started over dirty dishes." Mabel would laugh and add, "Your father married me to save the ranch, but I like to think I saved him too." Their marriage, begun in duty and practicality, blossomed into one of the great love stories of Promise Creek. The ranch prospered, eventually becoming one of the most successful in the territory. They faced droughts, harsh winters, and cattle thieves together, their partnership strengthened by the love that had grown between them. Each night, no matter how busy or tired they were, Ethan and Mabel washed the dishes together. It became their ritual, a daily reminder of those first tentative conversations that had bridged the gap between strangers bound by circumstance and lovers joined by choice. And whenever visitors commented on Ethan's willingness to help with such a domestic task, Mabel would exchange a knowing smile with her husband, both remembering how the simple act of washing dishes side by side had changed everything between them. "Some things are worth doing together," Ethan would say, his eyes never leaving Mabel's. "Especially the ordinary ones." On their 50th anniversary, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and a lifetime of memories, Ethan gave Mabel a gift: a painting of two figures standing at a wash basin, their profiles illuminated by golden sunlight streaming through a window. "To remember where it all began," he said, his voice still strong despite his years. Mabel traced the painted figures with fingers now gnarled by arthritis, but still capable of infinite tenderness. "As if I could ever forget." That evening, as always, they stood side by side at the sink, washing the dishes together, their movements slower but no less in harmony than they had been all those decades ago. The ranch had modern conveniences now, but this one tradition remained unchanged: a daily act of love that had begun when a cowboy who married out of duty discovered his heart while washing dishes beside the woman who would become his everything.